Hello, welcome back to PA 605, Organizational Behavior in Government Agencies. This is the second part of the presentation over groupthink and transboundary problems, which relates to the reading for PACBAC discussion number 6. So in the previous recording, we went through Janice's discussion of groupthink. And so now we're going to turn to Quarantelli, Bowen, and Lagadek's discussion of transboundary problems. And Quarantelli in particular is somebody who's very well known in disaster management, emergency management research kind of circles. If you read anything that relates to emergency management or disaster preparedness, you'll usually see him cited somewhere in there. So very kind of noted figure in that area. So in terms of the reading for this week, the authors describe this idea of transboundary problems. They discuss the term transboundary, they say, has become a conventional way to describe crises and disasters that jump across different societal boundaries, disrupting the social fabric of different social systems. And they use as examples the SARS outbreak or SARS pandemic that took place in 2003, which was significantly less severe than the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that we recently went through. And they also talk about the spread of a computer virus in 2003 also being an example. So since they're noting SARS as the original SARS as an example of a cross-boundary problem, obviously that means that SARS-CoV-2 would also fall into this category, and the H5N1 outbreak, if it does take on greater severity, if it does start spreading between people in society more, that would certainly be something that would affect America in the same way that the COVID-19 pandemic did, affecting businesses, affecting schools, really affecting all aspects of society in different ways. So they go on to define this idea of a transboundary problem as one where the threat jumps across many international and national political and governmental boundaries. It crosses functional boundaries, jumping from one sector to another and crossing from the private into the public sectors. So obviously, again, if we look at H5N1 as it exists today, avian influenza is something that's affected a lot of countries in Southeast Asia for a long time. It's been jumping around among different countries in that region for a long time. Obviously, it's jumping across state boundaries here in the United States. It affects the agricultural sector. Obviously, it affects right now the public health sector, the hospital sector. And if it does become more severe, it could have big impacts on our food supply chain and other areas of society as well. And certainly, private sector effects, agribusiness, the food industry, as I mentioned. But in terms of the public sector, putting greater emphasis in the public sector to do surveillance, to do testing, to try to monitor the extent of the problem so that it doesn't reach the kind of point that COVID-19 did, where we have to take kind of extraordinary measures. Second, a transboundary threat can spread very fast. Again, that was obviously an issue with COVID-19. The H5N1 seems to be rolling out more slowly, although there's been recent news stories about humans potentially having been infected with H5N1 and not realizing it. So it's possible that the actual spread of H5N1 in the real world is more substantial than what has been previously understood. So it is potential that the spread could occur faster over time. Third, there's no known central or clear point of origin, at least initially, along with the fact that the possible negative effects at first are far from clear. So, I mean, in terms of H5N1, we do have a pretty good understanding of, where the virus is originating from, how it's spread, those kinds of things. But the full sort of negative impacts are unclear, partially because, as we learned with COVID-19, viruses can mutate very quickly. So what is a real danger, or what is not a real danger to humans at one point in time, can very quickly transform into something that is a threat. So the fact that the threat is continuously kind of morphing creates a concern there. Some other transboundary scenarios they lay out are asteroid, comet strikes, which would obviously have a huge impact, depending on the size of the asteroid or comet, could be a national catastrophe or even a global catastrophe, and biotechnological threats. So things like, the altering of a virus as part of a scientific experiment, and if it were to get loose from the lab, the impacts of that. Or some people have looked at the editing of genes as a potential biotechnological threat, because if you alter genes in a certain way where the genetic change can be passed on to future generations. So somebody has a gene altered, and then they have a child, and that child inherits that altered gene, and then eventually, that can lead to downstream mutations that can't necessarily be anticipated. So that's seen as a biotechnological threat as well. So the authors ask, what does it mean for the management of transboundary disruption, which require increased cooperation between and across systems? Will decentralized systems be able to produce emergent transboundary cooperation? So, basically it's asking about, how do we coordinate? How do we build a system of cooperation to prepare for these kinds of transboundary disruptions? And will just kind of general decentralized systems be able to produce this kind of cooperation in the midst of a crisis? So it kind of comes down to how prepared do we need to be for these particular events? What sort of networks do we need to build in advance, or can we expect that kind of more general decentralized systems will be able to just kind of adapt to emerging situations? If early warning is possible at all, according to the authors, research has consistently shown that acceptable warnings have to come from legitimately recognized source, which is a concern today because there's so much kind of division in terms of how people look at the media, what some people consider to be a legitimate source, other people consider to be fake news. Even messages from the government, whether it's the federal government, state government, or local government, can be disregarded by people. So that's a concern today. They have to be consistent. The messages have to be consistent, and they have to indicate that the threat or risk is fairly immediate. So, with something, people tend to react to different types of threats in different ways. With a virus situation like H5N1, people might not see it as immediate of a threat if they haven't seen any evidence of their community, if they haven't had any experience with it. But if people see, a tornado warning and they see evidence in, outside their window that the weather might be getting bad, they may respond to that more immediately. If people see a wildfire, close to their home, they may respond fairly immediately. So the degree to which people determine immediacy can be an issue. People respond to some threats faster than others. These principles certainly pertain to the management of transboundary disruptions. So, again, with H5N1, there has been messaging going out on a regular basis from federal authorities in the states that have experienced H5N1 directly. They put out messages that I've seen. There have been messages in the media. There's been warnings about not drinking raw milk and not having contact with birds unless you're using proper protective equipment. But the degree to which people are acknowledging those messages and acting on those messages varies, I think, depending on, to a certain extent, on political ideology and just their level of previous experience, maybe with COVID-19 and other public health threats. Transboundary crises and disasters require some type of transboundary cooperation. For example, let's assume that a health risk is involved, such as H5N1. So if international cooperation is needed, who talks with whom about what? So who would be in charge of, if for some reason the United States needed to coordinate with other countries about H5N1, who would be the point person for doing that? Internationally, would it be the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Would it be the Secretary of State? Would it be the President? Personally, who's going to do that? At what time is action initiated? At what point do we look at the situation and say we need to reach out to our international partners about this? Who takes the lead in actually organizing the response? So again, would that be Health and Human Services Secretary? Would there be another sort of corona, similar to what they did with COVID-19? Would there be a special group that the vice president would chair? How would that be handled? What legal issues are involved? What is legally permissible as far as, closing businesses, closing schools? And since we've just gone through this with COVID-19, this is a pretty fraught issue because there's still people who remember, very clearly, some small businesses went out of business because of COVID-19, and there's still discussion about educational gaps and things like that. So there's still a lot of people who are very hesitant about taking any kind of action in response to a public health emergency that could have economic disruptions, educational disruptions, and there's states that have actively curtailed the authority of public health agencies to take those kinds of steps. So the legal issues in the United States would vary in large part from state to state, and even to some extent from locality to locality. There might be many experts and much technical information around. If so, and they are not consistent, whose voice and ideas should be followed. So again, this was kind of an issue during COVID-19 as far as, if you read kind of accounts of the federal decision making, who the president listened to kind of shifted over time. In the beginning, President Trump was listening to the more traditional kinds of health authorities. The Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time, Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, who was brought in to be a sort of coordinator of the response. But then over time, the president started to listen to more people who took a different attitude toward the pandemic and were more in favor of kind of a herd immunity approach and not engaging in lockdowns and not requiring masking and things like that. So, this question of whose voice and ideas should be followed, it's not just a question of who's going to be followed initially, but are those voices going to continue to be listened to in the long term, or eventually are authorities going to turn away from those voices when things become difficult and start seeking out voices that will tell them essentially what they want to hear? that the virus is just going to go away eventually, and we don't need to take these actions and things like that. The questions of what should be given priority, could a forced quarantine be enforced, what ethical issues would be involved, how to deal with limited vaccines, talking to the media and knowing what to tell them and not tell them. So these are all issues to one extent or another that did come up during COVID-19. So if you look at kind of that recent history, that should inform your thinking and kind of your approach with this H5N1 situation. Again, in real life, sustained human-to-human transmission hasn't been established. In the sort of hypothetical scenario that we're working with, it has. So you could get into this idea of, maybe if somebody's been exposed to somebody who has H5N1, should there be a quarantine policy enforced? There are some vaccines available for avian influenza, so should those be distributed in an organized fashion? Who should be prioritized in terms of receiving those vaccines? Should it be the elderly? Should it be children? Should it be farm workers? And then in terms of the mass media, how much should be communicated, and how should that be communicated and by whom? And this is kind of an interesting question at this point, because we're in a situation where recently the Trump administration has taken down some websites that contained data related to kind of the monitoring of avian influenza and some public health risks around the country. And I believe that due to a court decision, they had to reinstate some of those things. But we're kind of in a situation where the federal government, for various reasons, is removing access to some public-facing information, and so if we have a situation where the current administration is already kind of holding its cards close to the vest and not giving stuff away even before it becomes an emergency, what happens when it does become an emergency, and how could the media potentially overcome that obstacle? The authors go on to write, at a more general level of planning and managing, we can briefly indicate almost in outline form a half dozen principles that ought to be taken into account by disaster planners and crisis managers. So here, similar to, Janice provided some recommendations for overcoming groupthink or avoiding groupthink. So these are principles for disaster planners and crisis managers to deal with transboundary problems. First, a clear connection should be made between local planning and transboundary managing processes. So there, when people are doing planning for different kinds of emergencies at the local level, it should be done with this transboundary thinking in mind. It shouldn't be just kind of limited to, the fire department, working, one area, and the police working another area, and hospitals working their own sort of area. Everybody should be kind of coming together and kind of looking at this, looking at things as in a transboundary kind of way, and how are these different types of emergencies going to affect the community, and what are each of these different offices or agencies going to do to mediate that problem. Second, the appearance rather of new emergent social phenomena, including groups and behaviors, needs to be taken into account. These plans for transboundary problems need to be keeping up with the times. They need to be cognizant of changes in society, obviously, changes in the use of social media, as opposed to other, people paying more attention to social media than, local television and newspapers would be, something to keep in mind. If a community has more non-English non-English speaking people coming into the area. They need to be cognizant of that and update their messaging to reflect that change. If there's new sort of issues going on, for example, with the murder of George Floyd and all of the issues surrounding minority groups and policing in the United States, being cognizant of that in emergency planning and understand that there may be a certain level of mistrust between African American populations and the police. So in an emergency situation, if those groups are expected to coordinate with each other, recognizing that there could be some friction there. Third, there's the need to be imaginative and creative. So don't just kind of stick to the tried and true plans that have been in place, for decades, but be willing to kind of think outside the box in terms of public messaging and how to bring people to the table, to get people involved. There's in some of the things that I've been reading recently, they've been talking about building community resilience, and rather than just having people coming to regular meetings and talking about emergency planning and stuff like that, they hold like block parties and fun community kinds of events to draw people in and get people talking to each other. And then once they have people connected and people are feeling more relaxed with each other, then they start engaging in the real work. The fourth thing, exercises and simulations of disasters and crises must take into account transboundary contingencies. So again, you know, not just having tornado drills and not just having wildfire drills and not just having hurricane drills and hospital evacuation drills and things like that, but taking into account how these things can kind of morph into new kinds of events as well. Um, so, for example, with a situation like if hospital systems are planning for an ice storm, and they might say, okay, in an ice storm, we might expect an influx of people into the emergency room, and we have to prepare for that. But you also have to take into account that during an ice storm, you might have power failure. So what if you have all these people coming in seeking care and you have a power failure? How are you going to respond to that? So sort of building out, these different contingencies. Fifth, planning should be with citizens and their social groups and not for them. So being inclusive of people, not just planning on people's behalf, but actually including citizens and including people from different groups with different perspectives. So I've been, for example, I've been doing research myself recently on inclusive disaster preparedness involving people with disabilities. So if you're doing emergency planning and you're trying to anticipate the needs of people with disabilities in those situations, don't just, create the plans based on your own research. Obviously you should do research on your own, but also incorporate people who actually have different types of disabilities and have them share kind of their lived experiences, and maybe they could talk about actual circumstances that they've been in where there's been an emergency and challenges that they've had as a result of that. And the last one there, finally, there's a need to start thinking of local communities in ways different than they have been traditionally viewed. Up to now, communities have been seen as occupying some geographical space and existing in some chronological time. Instead, we should visualize the kind of communities that exist today are in cyberspace. So it's just kind of, thinking about the fact that, you know, the even though you might live in a particular town um, at a particular time, your social circle isn't limited to that geographic space. You're connected to people potentially all over the world. And they're arguing that emergency planners should recognize that and should be, willing to take advantage of that in terms of public messaging and the use of social media and things like that. So recognizing that, the flip side of that is, it used to be if you wanted to get the word out, you would use churches, you'd use community groups, things like that. But people might not be connected to those kinds of things in their specific locality anymore. So again, that's why you have to go into social media. You have to go into these other avenues to spread the word, because people may be more aware. They may have more direct contact with people in other states and even other countries than they do in some cases with people in their own community, for better or worse. So before we fully wrap up here, I wanted to kind of go back and try to bring the groupthink and transboundary readings together. So, there's a few things that I think sort of relate directly, in terms of these recommendations and groupthink. The idea of being imaginative and creative. Working in groups can facilitate a lot of imagination and creativity if done well. But groupthink can also lead to the same sort of approaches being taken time and time again. If there's somebody in a leadership position and they think this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we should do it, and nobody wants to cross that person, it can squelch that imagination and creativity. So groups need to be careful that the group dynamic is used for fostering new ideas and not for limiting new ideas. The idea of that second recommendation about being cognizant of emergent social phenomena, that takes into account the need that, depending on the situation, the people involved in the group may have to vary from situation to situation. There might be some situations where you have to bring in, representatives from different populations to give their perspective. You can't just use the same group necessarily time and time again to make decisions in emergency situations. You need to be willing to bring in outside perspectives. And as we discussed with groupthink, that's one of the signs of negativity when it comes to groupthink is outsiders are sort of left on the fringes. Exercises and simulations must take into account transboundary contingencies. So again, the idea to expand out your thinking and not be limited to thinking about one disaster at a time or one crisis at a time. Be willing to sort of have somebody in the mix who's playing devil's advocate and saying, well, what if this happens and what if this happens? And some people may push back and say, well, that's unlikely, or that, that's not going to happen, or that's never happened before. But having somebody in the mix who's sort of fighting against that and saying, well, we at least need to think about the possibility that this could happen, because, low probability, high consequence kinds of events do occur. And the idea of thinking about communities in different ways, expanding our perspective on what a community is and how people conceptualize communities. And this could even involve the types of groups that are used for these preparedness efforts. If you're involved in planning for cybersecurity kinds of events or cyber attack kinds of events, maybe it isn't the best thing to just bring together people in your community or even people in your state, but it might be good to participate in conversations and meetings that involve people from across the country, even people internationally who've dealt with cyber attacks, and figure out, what are they doing to address these things. So expanding out your purview and kind of getting lessons learned from a variety of different types of contexts. So transboundary scenarios are ones that can be very complex, and I think there's, given, recent events with the types of emergencies that people across the country have had to deal with, whether it's COVID-19 or the wildfires or a variety of situations that affect a large region of the country. Cyber attacks would be another one that's really a transboundary issue. So I think there has been an effort on the part of emergency preparedness personnel to expand their thinking, and avoid kind of getting stuck in these sort of groupthink, limited planning kinds of scenarios. But it's important to keep in mind that when you're looking at, the potential risk, potential danger involved, it's very easy for people at the sort of top of the food chain to sort of place limitations on that. For example, having just recently read books about, I think I mentioned this before, having recently read books about the Challenger accident back in 1986 and the Chernobyl incident, which occurred the same year, I believe. In both instances, you had people at the top saying, this may be a remote possibility, but it's highly unlikely. It's not going to happen. The chances of it happening are very low. Those kinds of things, and people going along with it because they were afraid of losing government contracts, or they were afraid of losing their position in their company or in the organization. That I think is especially evident if you look at the kind of the story of the Challenger. There were a number of meetings that took place where people raised really serious concerns about the booster rockets and the potential that there could be, a leak in the booster rockets at takeoff that could lead to an explosion. And people really argued forcefully, the morning of the Challenger incident, that the shuttle should not take off. And people at the top, for a variety of reasons, didn't want the shuttle launch to be delayed anymore. So ultimately, the side that wanted to do the launch won out, and history, obviously has recorded what happened. The shuttle blew up, all the astronauts' lives were lost. With Chernobyl, in the immediate sort of after the meltdown had begun, people were arguing that it wasn't as serious as people were saying it was, or it was just kind of a limited event, and only became only after people had really massively become contaminated with radiation, and it became evident that it was a very serious problem, did the leadership sort of wake up. So it's important to be prepared if you're involved in any sort of emergency response scenario, to be prepared to push back against people who will try to limit the perspective on how serious the danger is. And you don't want to be seen as alarmist, but at the same time, if there's a legitimate possibility that the issue could be more catastrophic than originally thought, that needs to be taken into account. And I think this discussion of transboundary problems brings that out, and Janice offers some good recommendations for how leaders can build into the system how to avoid that kind of groupthink scenario. So for next week, the packback number 6 is the assignment for next week. And then also over the next week, take a look at the SWOT analysis material that's in module 7, because that will give you some pointers, some hopefully valuable information about how you can go about doing your SWOT analysis, along with the information that's available in PackBack. If anybody has any questions about that, let me know. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.